I'm Venus with Galaxy Inc. And for this week's writing tips, we're going to be continuing on with our Elements of Writing series, and we're on number 7. And this week we're going to be talking about antagonists and villains. Perfect timing since we're coming up on Halloween, so I thought that'd be a fun one to do this week. So we're going to talk about different types of antagonists and villains, because I kind of think they're a little separate. Basically, an antagonist is a person or a thing that actively opposes or is hostile to someone or something, an adversary. I usually think of it as 3 different kinds. There is your everyday antagonist. So this would be Severus Snape in Harry Potter, or Ali's mother in The Notebook. Then you have the corrupt organization antagonist. So that's the Capitol in Hunger Games, or the Republic of Gilead in Handmaid's Tale. Then you have the internal antagonist. Bryony's guilt in Atonement, or Landon's pride in A Walk to Remember. Those are kind of these different types of antagonists within the story. Then you have villains. And villains are kind of defined as a character whose evil actions or emotion or motives are important to the plot, and the person or thing responsible for specified trouble, harm, or damage. So I think of villains as kind of more classic villain. So you've got Voldemort, the White Witch, Sauron. They don't always have like a very strong motivation to be evil. They just are, and they're usually very evil, right? They're not complex. They're just really bad guys. And then you have more unusual antagonists. So, and this kind of goes along with the conflict video that I did a couple weeks ago, because you've got the man versus nature, right? So you've got nature like in The Road, where, you know, you're just trying to survive. But there's also antagonists within that, or that are people that are bad and they eat people. You've got technology, you know, which can be an antagonist. It's not really a person, it's the thing, but like iRobot, that kind of thing. You've got the supernatural, which I think kind of still plays into like everyday antagonist, because supernatural can kind of play that role. Or villain if it's really bad, if you're thinking of like oh gosh, I'm thinking of like the Supernatural, the show, and all of like the first season has all these like regular normal ghosts and the supernatural things a lot of people are familiar with in stories and urban legends. And then you've got a condition like cancer or something that can be the antagonist, or the time traveler's wife, the husband, just he has a condition where he time travels and he can't control it. And so that becomes the main crux of the story and the main antagonist in the story. Not all antagonists are villains, but all villains are antagonists. So how do you create a good antagonist, a good villain even? How do you make a character that readers will hate, and they'll hate to love, but they'll kind of like them, or at least it feels believable? So how do you start that process? Well, I mean, the first one is you have to be believable. Not likable. Don't mistake that. You do not have to have a likable character, but you do need to have a believable character. So what is your character's motivations? Why is your antagonist this way? Why do they do what they do? Does it make sense why they do what they do? Does it make sense that Joffrey Baratheon in Game of Thrones acts the way he does with the backstory he's been given? Spoiled? Check. Sociopath? Yes. But how did he get that way? He's allowed to get everything that he ever wanted with no, pushback. And he was loved only by one person, and that person is basically very monstrous herself. Is there a certain point there where that character has to take control of his own actions? Yes, of course. And did he have to become that way? No. We saw with his 2 younger siblings that being raised by the same parents doesn't mean that they have to be that horrible or cruel. So you have a character who is both horrible and people hate him, and they hate him. And it does still make sense though within the story and the context of the story. So that's a way to create a very believable bad guy, and this is definitely a guy for sure. I also think of characters like Umbridge from Harry Potter, and how for her, she thought she was doing good. To her, she was doing what was right. And you don't have to do this with every villain or antagonist. So characters don't always have to think that they're right, okay? But in this instance, she did think that she was doing what was right. She truly believed that in her heart, that she was doing what was proper. And so her creating these rules and things to her made sense. And that's all that matters, because your antagonist needs to make sure that things make sense to them. And you as the writer need to make sure that you know the motivations of your own characters. If you don't, then you end up with these really flat kind of characters. And that just leads me into the next part, which is that you should know your antagonist just as well as you know your protagonist. You should know your antagonist and their motivations just like you know your main character's motivations. It doesn't make sense if you don't. And it'll be obvious to the reader if you don't have it. If your person is a bad person just because they like to be a bad person, that doesn't make sense, and the reader's going to pick up on it really quickly. And it really only works in things like comic books and comedy. It doesn't work when you're trying to tell a rounded story with rounded characters. Then you have to ask, does your antagonist and protagonist balance each other out? So one of the things that I see is a lot of times is you'll have, especially in children's fiction, you'll have a very smart child who is somehow amazingly smarter than the antagonist, and they beat them quickly and pretty easily, and you're like, man, this is one dumb person, like this dumb antagonist that doesn't know what's going on. Maybe balance that out a bit. Some writers do it by making their child a child genius, which eye roll, but it's okay if your good guy needs help or can't do it on their own. It's okay if your protagonist needs help or can't do things on their own. They need a little bit of guidance. It's okay if they don't beat the bad guy themselves or they need help. It really bothers me when this big baddie who's like supposed to be like the epitome of bad people is beaten so easily by a child or by something simple or just the wave of a wand. It needs to be more complex than that. At least have something that needs to be solved in order to beat the bad guy. Then you need to make sure that your antagonist gets a moment of triumph. And then they can fail and fall. But your antagonist, there needs to be a certain point in the story where you're worried. The reader's worried about whether the bad guy's going to win. And I know that in our heads we're saying, no, they can't possibly win. That's not, I wouldn't read the story if the bad guy won. But it's okay for that to happen sometimes. And I know in Game of Thrones it happened a lot, which drove people nuts. They're like, well, I don't even know who the good or the bad people are. And as much as I'm not the hugest fan of the series, because I like a very strong hero and I really struggle with finding heroes within the story. I also do like that the bad guys sometimes win and not everybody gets their comeuppance, and that's kind of how it works in life. Not everybody who does bad things always gets justice, and I like that complexity within my stories as well. Then you also need to give your antagonist a bit of a flaw. I do not mean, if you recall when I talked about the history of disabilities, I do not mean a physical disability to reflect that your character is bad. Okay, so I want to make that clear. Go watch the video if you're curious about what I mean by that. What I do mean is that it's okay for your character, your antagonist, to have fears, to have things that hold them back, to have reasons why they wouldn't pursue the protagonist in some way. It's okay for your antagonist to be a little bit more well-rounded. And then keep in mind that most people are not pure evil. So it's okay to give your antagonist qualities that might be considered endearing. And I don't want, you don't always want your readers to be torn. If you've got a truly terrible character who's committing genocide, on a daily basis, I can understand why you might be hesitant to make them seem like a really nice guy. But I want to remind you that in real life, that's kind of what happens. There are some really terrible people out there who have done some really awful things and are also supposedly good family men or great with children, or they enjoy a game of golf. So add those things in there to add complexity to your antagonist. Now we're going to get into a little bit of my issues that I have with a lot of antagonists and villains that I see in stories. So this is kind of a rant, but it's also things that maybe you should think about before you add them in. So the first one is bullies who bully in front of adults. So it drives me nuts, and I see it a lot in some of these like teen shows that my teenagers like to watch, where for some reason popular girl, popular boy doesn't like this other character, and they bully them in front of adults. So like there's a show called Go, exclamation point, and in the show there is this girl who like actively bullies this other girl in front of the adults, and the adults are just like, oh, okay, let's all dance now. And you're like, wait, nobody's going to address the fact that this kid just bullied this kid in front of an adult? Like, I don't know any adults who are usually okay with this. Like, I mean, I'm sure that there are some out there, but like, you need to paint a pretty good picture. But most of these adults in these stories are pretty nice and wouldn't bully another person actively. And so to have a child be bullied in front of them and them do nothing, it feels very odd. And really it feels like, okay, well, we just got to establish how awful this bully is, And along the same lines, bullies who dislike characters for no other reason than them just being good at something or something. There's this show, Free Rein. Girl's good at riding horses. She's from America, and instantly, like day one, showing up at the stables that she lives next door to, there's a girl who doesn't like her. Like, just right away. And I mean, there is not even like a moment of trying to get to know each other. And, they're kind of setting up like, oh, she's rich and she's, kind of stuck up, and that's why. But it doesn't really make sense. And because she's able to form friendships and relationships with other characters, and they show that throughout the story, it just doesn't make sense why she'd just single this one person out just for no reason. Like, there's just no reason, or at least no good reason that's presented. I also don't like cartoon villains. The evil mustache twirling, petting a cat, cartoon villain. And it works in cartoons and it works in comedy, and maybe you can play around with that trope a little bit, make it kind of funny, but I don't really need to have those characters be empathized with, especially if you're making them kind of really goofy and ridiculous. And I mean, they're fun when they're cartoon villains, like I think like Pinky and the Brain, or I'm thinking about Inspector Gadget, with you never see his face but he's always petting a cat, right? Those are kind of fun to play around with, but they are flat. I mean, just completely flat characters. And you better have one whiz bang of a story if you're going to include a flat villain like that. I also don't like stories where a person has had a hard childhood and the writer is using that to explain why this person is now like a sociopath or is now just horribly cruel or evil, especially since statistically speaking, they've done numerous studies, and kids who've been through a lot of trauma typically are more empathetic, not less, and as adults typically go into fields that help other people, so they become like teachers, psychologists, social workers, things like that. So this idea that you had a hard childhood and now you've grown up and you're going to become this horrible person, I don't like that at all. And it doesn't, not everybody has a redemption story. So like, it's almost like a way that the writer is trying to make it seem like, well, it's kind of okay because look at this horrible childhood that they have. And so I think of the book Push, which if you've seen the movie, it's called Precious. And there's a moment where the mother, who's been terribly abusive, says, well, what about me? I needed someone to love me and there was nobody there. And so it's not fair that he loved you because she was abused. And even though like you have this moment of like, okay, I get like psychologically why you have some issues, it doesn't excuse your behavior. Like, what you did was horrible and you knew it, and now here you are bearing your soul, but it doesn't matter because you did all these horrible things, and you knew better, and so that kind of bothers me when I see it in stories, like, oh, but they had this hard life, and so that's why it's okay that they're this really horrible person. And you're like, no. And then, and this one should be very simple, but I hate bad guys who are bad just to be bad, or because they like it. Like, that's always very odd to me. They enjoy being evil. They like doing bad things. And you're just kind of like, okay, like, but why? Why do you like that? Why do you do that? And it makes the character flat. If you got to have a reason why they enjoy doing this stuff, or, something. And to me, what a lot of those kind of things that bother me is lazy writing, because there are some incredibly wonderful, nuanced stories and antagonists in a story. And I think about this book that I read as a kid, and it's the book that made me fall in love with reading, called Away is a Strange Place to Be by H.M. Hoover. And at the beginning of the book, there is a boy who is very rich, and he shows up, at the hotel that this girl and her uncle own. He is demanding, he is rude, he is just spoiled rotten, right? And both children are kidnapped and forced to work as slave labor on a space station. And they, of course, have to escape. And one of my favorite things about that character is that character seems like the antagonist, right? And it is the antagonist for the girl. He drives her nuts. He's all, prim and proper, but he's so spoiled. When they're kidnapped, he's like, well, I'm going to find my parents and they're going to let us go. And, when they knew who I am, and it doesn't work that way, right? And so then they have to come up with a different plan. And he's devastated that it doesn't work, that he can't throw his weight around and get away with it. And you begin to feel for him. And there is a redemptive character arc for him. And that's okay, because we're later introduced to the real antagonist of the story. And when you're introduced to the real antagonist, you're like, okay, yes, I'm okay with this. This is good. That's the way to make a very complex antagonistic story with technically two antagonists that feels real and raw, and even has a redemptive story arc, and it has a non-redemptive one too. It's a hard book to get a hold of, and so part of me doesn't want to give away what happens, and then part of me is like, you people will never read this because you'll never be able to find this book. I think I got a library copy because I couldn't find a regular copy of it out there on the shelves. And unlike some of the other H.M. Hoover books, it has not been reprinted, which is very sad. Anyways, so that's really all I have about villains and antagonists. I love seeing rich and complex stories, and I think that writers can do that, and there's a fun way of doing it. And if you want to create your very flat villain, just have fun with it, and make sure that you're playing around with the idea and the concepts, and maybe adding a lot of humor in there so that we understand what you're going for. So don't forget to press like and subscribe to my channel. I post new writing tips almost every Friday. If you think you're ready to hire an editor, you can contact me at galaxy-inc.com. I've been Venus with Galaxy Inc. I hope your writing is out of this world.